June 15th, 2010. Mark Anthony Neal. Dr. Mark Anthony Neal is a professor in the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. He is the author of several publications on music, including That's the Joint, the Hip-Hop Studies Reader, which he co-edited with Murray Foreman, and more recently a contribution to a book analyzing Nas's landmark album Illmatic called Born to Use Mics. This Black Music Month, welcome Mark Anthony Neal to Blackademics. So in the book Born to Use Mics, you have your chapter on jazz, hip-hop, and fathers. And you talk about Queensbridge as kind of a gumbo, cultural gumbo space. And gumbo, you know, of course, it's a Louisiana dish. It has a lot of references to jazz there. So I'm wondering if you could expound upon New York as that cultural center, that gumbo center.
You know, New York was a port city. So everybody who was coming from someplace else came someplace else to New York. So whether they were coming from the Caribbean, whether or not they were coming from the South. And so what you get in New York City, particularly in the mid-20th century, really is this really interesting mix of culture. Even when you see things like, you know, some of the movies and films from that period of time, you know, West Side Story being a good example. I mean, West Side Story fundamentally is about Puerto Rican and Italian youth trying to share space, you know, all coming from different places. You know, what we know is Latin boogaloo or Latin soul, you know, we're Latin musicians coming from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, trying to figure out how to succeed as musicians in New York City, living amongst African Americans, right? So they took traditional, you know, Latin rhythms and put them in conversation with African American melodies, and, you know, you had this Latin boogaloo thing. You know, hip hop can't even be born without this kind of incredible mixture. You know, I can remember when I was growing up in the Bronx, and we go to Pelham Bay Park, you know, to play on Sundays, and you'd have West Indian cats playing soccer, you have the Puerto Rican cats playing, you know, baseball, you know, all of us running around playing that little ghetto game. So I think, you know, that whole melting pot thing, you know, I think, you know, everybody's comfortable with that term, and folks have talked about the salad, you know, metaphor for thinking about diversity. But it was just so alive and vibrant in New York. You know, it didn't mean that there wasn't challenges and there weren't struggles. But at least in terms of my nostalgia for that period of time, it was just an incredible energy that came out of that. And Nas would have had access to that, you know, in Queensbridge the same way I had access to it in the South Bronx.
Word. So I saw on your blog a post about the Boondocks a couple days ago, and I find the Boondocks both hilarious and problematic. I was hoping, you know, we could get man's perspective on what Aaron McGruder's doing. And
you know, there was that great, you know, conversation when it first debuted a few years ago, and I think the number was the term nigger was used like 47, 48 times in the first episode.
Yeah,
a lot of folks were turned off by that, and I remember McGruder saying that the reaction to the use of the word in the episode was reflective of how juvenile our conversations were about race in this country, right? That the word, you know, on a theoretical level, on a historical level, is so much more, right? There's been a long history of it being utilized in very complex and complicated, you know, and difficult and problematic ways, right? And if we're going to talk about the word, let's talk about it. And I think, you know, he's done a good job of using the Boondocks as a vehicle to question certain kind of status quos within the black community, to call out certain figures who are problematic, you know, the Martin Luther King episode being a great example of it. But I also think he's also doing it for a young audience. And because he's doing it for a young audience, he has to be engaged in the vernacular that they're engaged in. I think for a 17 or 18 or 29-year-old person watching the Boondocks, the language is so natural for them, right, that the points that McGruder wants to make really do hit home. I think older folks are so caught up in the language and some of the imagery that they never get to the messages, right? The provocations that, you know, he's trying to bring about.
Yeah, okay. And my last question is, you're a public intellectual, and there's a great book that we read in undergrad. It was about public intellectuals by bell hooks and Cornel West.
Breaking Bread.
Yeah, Breaking Bread.
Breaking Bread.
So I was hoping we could break bread and get your perspective on the role of the public intellectual. What do you see as your role, in the Black liberation struggle in the Black community?
I love that book. That was one of my favorite books. That book was actually my introduction to Cornel West. I had been reading a great deal of Bell Hooks at that point in time. I hadn't read much Cornel West. So that book was my introduction to Cornel West, and I liked the way that they honestly talked about some of the difficulties of living the life of the mind and trying to live a life of the mind and be relevant. And so I've been incredibly influenced by them. I've been influenced by Manning Marable. I've been influenced by Mike Eric Dyson, Todd Boyd. I mean, I've been influenced by a range of folks and thinking about how do we cut the gap, erode the gap between what we do in the academy, right, what we do in the ivory tower, and what resonates in the lives of everyday folks. I don't do public policy, right? I'm not an economist. My realm is culture, and I think it's my job, and my responsibility to be able to write and think about culture in a way that reflects what everyday folks are consuming, but also attempting to equip them with critical sensibilities to read through, the obvious forms of ideology and other things that function through popular culture. And I try to do that in as many ways as possible. There are the academic books, which serve more than anything politically a role of getting other academics to think differently about what popular culture is, right, and the value of it. The blog and the blogosphere in general, Web 2.0 has been such a valuable tool, I think, for many of us who do this work now, because it allows us really to be able to have conversations with everyday folks, to be everyday folks ourselves, to be able to go to Twitter or Facebook and really have intense conversations about pressures or death in the family, or death at the funeral. The new Chris Rock film. And so it's been wonderful for me. And of course now with increased technology and be able to do, podcasts and video podcasts, I think it just gives us a tremendous amount of tools to remain in conversation with people, right? The idea of the ivory tower scholar at this point in time, I think is passé. I think virtually everybody recognizes that, we are legitimized, not simply by the work that we do in the academy, but the value of that work to everyday people, right? And that's always been my case. When I think about, say, the influence of someone at Manning Marable, and we do very different kinds of work, but when I first started reading his work in the early 90s and met him a few times, one of the things that struck me about him was that, he wrote this column, Beyond the Color Line, which he offered for free for syndication to the Black press. And I thought that was such an important model of being a public intellectual that's different than being on Charlie Rose. Yeah. That's different than being on TV One, right? It's just, writing for a broad public and specifically writing for a Black public. And so one of the things I've tried to do with my blog and whatever online writing I do, I offer that work up for free, to Black zines, on the web. So Esther Ivory and seeingBlack.com has been running my stuff now for almost a decade. There's a magazine in Britain called The New Black Magazine that runs my stuff. I think that kind of stuff is really important. And it's also been important for me to open up my blog space for other voices. So it's been important to see younger scholars and younger thinkers, to give them a space to think out loud, the way that I've been able to think out loud, for 10 or 15 years.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah.